Welcome back to Barbarians of Lemuria over Conan Exiles, or whatever I'm going to title this series. Probably just explaining Barbarians of Lemuria or something. Anyway, we've now made it to the Gazeteer of Lemuria chapter, which basically translates to the setting the game comes with. And as a tabletop RPG setting, it's at least pretty good. So first off, they go into the history of the world, and to give a brief overview, there were some guys called the Sorcerer Kings who, well, they may have once been human, but their magic mutated them into something else if they ever were. The Sorcerer Kings used magic and wanted to become gods with their magic. This ended up freeing a guy called Hadron, who is the Dark Lord and lives in the Void and is like the master of all demons, who ended up basically getting unleashed from the world. There was an Age of Darkness, and it ended when a magic sword was created, or that defeated Hadron and sent him back to the Void. From there was Ages of Men, Sorcerer Kings coming back, etc. So basically a very sort of brief history to get the players started and such with the game and tell the GM what they can expect from the setting. Then they give an overview of the gods of Lemuria. Now, this isn't necessarily anything like a big Bible or massive storybook or anything. It's basically just enough to get the players started with a campaign and to have some idea of what's going on in the setting. It's more a primer than anything else. But you basically have all the different gods you'd expect for a fantasy setting. And like you have gods of sleep, of death, gods of sleep, of beauty, of smithing, of life, of building, etc. So, and you also have the dark gods. These are primarily the Lord of the Void, Hadron, like I said, but also some guys like the God of Madness, and also various gods of sacrifice, fire, some other things. So, and those are basically the gods of Lemuria. And, well, there are others, like, just basically a short section on the gods, so, yeah. Now, next up, there are the races of Lemuria. Now, in Sword and Sorcery, fantasy races are basically close enough to human for combat purposes that you don't really need in-depth racial mechanics like you might find in, say, Dungeons & Dragons. Instead, fantasy races are, in Barbarians of Lemuria, are determined by basically a few boons and flaws that they're more likely to possess than humans are. So you have the Blue Giants, who are, well, like their name suggests, they're really tall. In this case, it's like 7 or 8 feet tall. Interestingly enough, they're known for basically being nomadic merchants who aren't particularly warlike. Then you have the Gruth, who are basically ape men. You could potentially see them as sort of an in-between step in evolution between humans and apes. And things like these actually do appear in Sword and Sorcery. Conan fights one in Rogues in the House. Though I think the Gruth are meant to be a bit more advanced than Thag was. Thag was basically somewhere between a chimpanzee and a human in intelligence, and the Gruth seem to be a bit more intelligent. Next up, you have the Kalokon, who seem to be based off of Blemmies, at least in terms of appearances, as in they don't have heads, and they have an eye on their chest, though aside from that, they don't really have anything in common with Blemmies, so not quite sure why I brought them up, honestly. But anyway, these guys were created by dark magic, and basically mostly serve the Witch Queen, but there are other ways that people who could have them. Now, up next are the Sloth. No, the Morgul. The Morgul are basically blood-drinking vampires. They look human at first, but as time goes on, they become something a bit more like Nosferatu. Or Count Orlok in the original movie. Though, well, not exactly like him. They're more like a sort of more bestial depiction of vampires. They are very long-lived, though their exact lifespan is up to the GM, whether it's centuries or if they truly are immortal, at least unaging. Yeah, so you start off human-like, very pale, but as time goes on, their bodies become less human. Now, up next, we have the Sloth. The Sloth are women-headed servants. They're a bit similar to what you might call a Naga in some other fantasy games, though they don't really have much to do with the mythological Naga and aren't really much like them, except in some appearance similar to some fantasy game Naga. Honestly, I think it might be better to describe them as somewhat like well, honestly, I think they're more inspired by that thing Conan kills in, God, I can't remember the story's called, but it's the one where Conan has to deal with corrupt cops. Next up, there are the Sorcerer Kings. So, yeah, like, they're a bit serpentine, a bit like lizard men, or sorry, like snake folk, except, well, more like they have serpentine faces and the rest of their bodies are fairly human, except being incredibly, well, sort of albino levels of pale. Like, well, don't know, that was bad wording, albinos are human, so, too, but, like, Sorcerer Kings, I'll put a picture up of them so you know what I'm talking about. Like, they might look human, but, it's pretty clear that they aren't, or at least not anymore. Now, next up, after the Sorcerer Kings, we have the Winged Men, who are basically, well, guys with wings, like people with wings who can't, let me check. Yeah, wings are functional. They can glide or even fly for short distances if unencumbered. So yeah, they seem to be more inspired by things from that Flash Gordon or whatever it was. So yeah, I think that's their main inspiration. Now, next we have the geography of Lemuria. So most of Lemuria is tropical, which is one of the reasons why they say most people don't really wear much armor in it. But I would like to note that if you want to do some sort of Arctic adventure or exploring a tundra exists. Anyway, so Lemuria, most of it's tropical, jungles, plains, a few deserts here and there, and it's basically ruled over by various city-states. You could potentially see it as a sort of late Bronze Age, early Iron Age setting in terms of the government types. Or at least in terms of the organization, though it's more of a generic fantasy that doesn't really resemble any particular period in history. Yeah, they do have a map and such, so you can navigate based on that, I suppose, and they give details of the various city-states, which all have their own characters and functions, so yeah, I'd say so. And anyway, we have, let's see, okay, oh yeah, there also are Frozen Lands, the City of Magicians, Seas, Ruins, and now, okay, here we go. At the end part of the Gazeteer of Lemuria, we have Beasts of Lemuria. This is where we get to the various animals, and this system is versatile enough that you could make any animal with it. So, to sum it up in a few words, the animals, by and large, their stats are determined by their size. The smaller the animal, the less lifeblood, less strength, the lower priority for initiative, as well as the less movement ability. The larger the animal, they higher initiative priorities, more damage, more lifeblood, and more movement. And, yeah, so if you know how big the animal is, you can have a decent idea of its stats. And there are creature boons and flaws where they can have something like different modes of attack. Like, for example, an Ankylosaur could potentially headbutt someone, maybe, and have a big tail as well. There also are creatures that have, there also are things like creatures that are particularly docile, and ones that are excellent hunters and such. Now, in terms of the various animals, we have things like, well, most of them are fantasy creatures, or dinosaurs. Like, we have an Andrak, which is basically a lion-like creature. You have, I'm not going to tell you all of them, but you have a Behemothon, which is basically a Kraken. You have the Banth, which is a sort of Triceratops. And, like, I could go on. They even have one that's very obviously a Baryonyx. Also, bears, T-Rex, basically. Things that might as well be a crocodile, as well as some more obscure things like this 6-armed turtle monster, the Dracophon. And I could go on, but I think you get the idea. A lot of these creatures could just be stand-ins for others' creatures, and you could run a completely historical setting with no fantasy creatures in it. Or no dinosaurs, either. So, like, it's pretty much can be whatever you basically want, and once again, I am skipping over a lot of content here because I want you to get this book yourself, but they even have basically giant scorpions and killer yetis. As well as the Swampus from The Future is Wild. I have no fucking idea what that's doing here, and I don't even really like The Future is Wild. I think it kind of fails as a you know, that's not the point. I'm never gonna revisit that show. Oh, they have terror birds, which are literally just a prehistoric creature. Anyway, so moving through this, they also have wolves, which are pretty much the only just straight up still living creature that's in this thing. And next up, we get to the Bloodless. Now, the Bloodless they're undead. Like, the Bloodless is what they call undead in Lemuria. And, for the most part, the Bloodless are like any other enemy. Except they basically just die if they lose all their lifeblood, which is similar to all the other enemies anyway, so I don't know why I brought that comparison. But anyway, they do not suffer wounds. They have life force, which is a measure of the arcane power that keeps them alive. You have the zombie and skeletons, which are rabble. You have bloodless sorcerer kings, which are wizards, obviously. You have other guys, too, like necropedes, skittering hands, and necrophages. And necrophages are basically fantasy ghouls. Now, next up, we have demons. So, demons are basically anything that is summoned by a sorcerer. They are often servants of the Dark One, but aren't necessarily always that. Like, there are other things that there are other things that can be considered demons, so yeah, like, not often, but not always servants of the Dark One. And they have a lot of different rules for demons. So, demons come in 3 categories, much like human enemies. These are, well, they don't have the same categories as human enemies, but they have 3 categories like human enemies, is what I'm saying. I hope you get that. Now, these categories with demons are minor, lesser, and greater. Minor demons are equivalent in initiative to rabble, lesser to toughs, and greater to villains. That being said, demons are tougher, so to speak, than the demon than the typical category equivalent to them, at least generally speaking. And demons have various powers. Minor demons have 1. Demons that are lesser demons have 2. And the most powerful demons have 4, though once again, you can get more powers for them under some circumstances. Demons also have their own attributes and such, and they give sample demons. So then the chapter ends with the Lemurian lexicon, which is basically just giving a bunch of things of it. Sorry, people, not things of it, people in Lemuria, and locations and words that are important. And you know what? I think... Yeah, checking the time that I've been recording, I think that I'm going to do the Mysteries of Lemuria chapter as well. Yeah, so once we get through the Mysteries of Lemuria chapter, there would be like 1 more chapter, so 1 more video in this series, and it might as well reward you with another chapter. So, the Mysteries of Lemuria chapter is basically their chapter on anything magical. Or, like, Mystery of Lemuria, magic is the main thing. Okay, well anyway, the Mysteries of Lemuria chapter is mostly about magic, or specifically alchemists, sorcerers, and priests. And these categories can intersect, but they won't necessarily intersect, if you get what I'm meaning. So the first off, we have alchemists. So how alchemy works is, depending on your skill in alchemy, you generally generate various alchemy points between sessions. And then you can use these alchemy points to create various things. And once again, you can spend a maximum of 5 craft points, is what they call those saved up points, per adventure. And oh yeah, they represent time as well as material. Actually, let me read it in full. These rules will be enough for you to at least understand it. So, the alchemy. So you get craft points between adventures, equal to your ranks in alchemy. So for example, 3 ranks in alchemy gets 3 craft points. Sorry, you can spend them over a period of time. So, to give an example of this, let's say you want to create something that requires you to use a massive amount of craft points. Well, what you might do is spend a little bit of it in one time, spend a little more on another, spend more on a third, etc. And throughout and eventually you'll have it built up. And you cannot spend more than 5 craft points per adventure, and they cannot be saved between adventures, so they represent time as well as materials. So anyway, you have preparations that cost various craft points. These preparations are common, uncommon, legendary, and mythic. Mythic costs 8, so basically you can't make more than one of those for 2 adventures because of the amount it costs. Legendary costs 4, uncommon costs 2, and common costs 1. And pretty obviously, they are increasing. The more the craft points it costs, the more increased in utility they are. So anyway, moving on from this, we have so preparations basically go into 2 categories: potions and what I'm going to call magic items. They're not quite magic items, but close enough for our purposes. So basically, potions at common level are basically things like sleep inducers, painkillers, etc. And also, this is fitting in with sword and sorcery, because you could potentially have, say, dust of paralysis, or a potion that does something like rare, but not, these things should probably be rare in sword and sorcery settings, but not necessarily unheard of. Now, moving on from this, we have uncommon potions, which give various temporary boosts, like buff to mind and stuff. We have then legendary potions, which are things like love, appearing young, shape-shifting. Then we have mythic potions, which include things like making you immortal, or rather, making you not die of old age, though you could potentially wither depending on how sadistic your GM is, if the game ever gets that far. So anyway, you then get to the devices and creations, as they call it, which I called magic items, but in retrospect that's a bad term for them, because they're not all necessarily magical. At the lowest level of them, there's things like masterwork armor, masterwork tools, stuff like that. That isn't necessarily magical at all, but just very well made. Then you get increasing levels, where things like uncommon, you have things like harder weapons and armor that roll a bonus die when rolling for damage. You have things like microscopes, periscopes, telescopes, mundane stuff, but then you get to the legendary stuff, where you have things like lightning guns, legendary armor, skyboats, aluminum, plants and animals into deadly life forms, fucking golems, that, like, yeah, they call them automatons, but that would basically be golems, stuff like that. And then under mythic, well, I mean, you have things like brain transfer machines, sentient houses, semi-sentient machines, chemical vats that can create life, and land-breast hybrids. Basically, this is where you get into stuff that, yeah, is clearly magical, but is just a different form of magic. Or, if not magical, then it's mad science. Or, yeah, or stuff like that. So, next up we get priests and druids. So, druids in Barbarians of Lemuria serve demonic dark gods, whereas priests serve normal gods. Though, yeah, even the normal gods aren't necessarily nice guys in sword and sorcery settings. But anyway, so you have the dark gods, the normal gods, oh, and, yeah. So, basically, as a priest, what you can do is, you get fate points depending on how much devotion you give to your god. Or gods, I guess. And so, like, doing a sermon would get you a small amount of devotion, for example, while something larger, like, say, I don't know, a human sacrifice or an animal sacrifice, which would be preferable, I hope, would get you something far larger. Fate points can be regained, and fate points relate to the domains. You typically use them to grant a one-time boon or flaw to a short activity or task. So, for example, let's say you worship, let's say you worship a god of war, very apt. You might be able to, with your fate points, get various boons and flaws related to the battlefield. If that, like, yeah, so... And next up, we have magicians, spellcasters, sorcerers. They're normally the bad guys in Barbarians of Lemuria, and are generally feared, and are quite often evil. However, there are heroes in sword and sorcery who use magic, so there isn't anything wrong with having a player character who is a sorcerer and not evil. Though they will be a massive exception to the general rule of how sorcerers are in these sorts of things. So, how does magic work? Well, there are basically a few ways, so to speak. So, first off, we have arcane power. This is the magical energy, and it's what spellcasters use to cast spells. So, arcane power has a few different... So, arcane power, it depends on what your skill level as a sorcerer, but I think we went through that already, so for now we'll just move on. There are a few different spell types and spell magnitudes. At the lowest, and also one thing to note, sorcery there is no magical healing in this game. They might be able to repair inanimate objects, they can do that, but sorcerers cannot heal. If you want healing, you should probably use alchemy. But anyway, the sorcerers... So, where's they at? Oh yeah, first off, we have cantrips. These are things that involve the weakest expenditures of arcane power. Just very minor pieces of magic. Like that doesn't really have much of a roll penalty to cast. You might even have a bonus to cast these spells because of how easy it is to use them. You might... it's stuff like very minor illusions, causing someone pain, but no real injury, maybe paralyzing someone from one round with your gaze. Stuff like that. Then we have the first magnitude spells. And also, like, cantrips cost very little arcane power. 1 or 2. Now, next up, we get first magnitude, like I said. So, first magnitude spells are the spells you're going to use most often. And now, I would like to note that Barbarians of Lemuria is a successful example of soft magic in tabletop games. That's normally very difficult to pull off without making it ridiculously overpowered. Anyway, first magnitude spells have, basically, these are what your sorcerer can do. Sorry, these spells mimic something that a normal person could do if they had enough time and the right materials. So, for example, a levitation spell might be equivalent to a rope and pulley system. A fireball might be equivalent to shooting someone with an arrow. Taming an animal might just be taming an animal that could be tamed by a human with enough time and equipment. Think of first magnitude spells as a shortcut. Even if they take time, they'll probably take less time than what it would normally do, and you don't need tools for them, or at least not the same tools, which we'll get to. First magnitude spells cost 5 arcane power, but can be reduced to 2 arcane power by taking various requirements. So, for example, let's say you want to shoot a fireball. Like this, and keep in mind, fireballs do actually appear in Conan stuff. Like, in, the Scarlet Citadel, Conan, there's literally a wizard who shoots a fireball at Conan. So, big flashy spells are in line with this stuff, even if magic is generally more rare in sword and sorcery than in typical fantasy, or at least a lot of fantasy. So now, let's go back to the fireball example. So, let's say your wizard wants to shoot a fireball, but it's the start of the adventure, and they don't want to use up too much arcane power. And a fireball is a very good example to go with, because it's really easy to get some very good material components for this sort of thing. Or rather, requirements. So, let's say so they want to reduce it to 2 arcane power, let's say, the bare minimum, because they don't want to use up too much early in the adventure. Well, the first requirement for this is line of sight. So, there's a sight, they're picking up the line of sight requirement. They need to be able to see someone to shoot a fireball at them. So that's down to 4 arcane power. Next up, let's say it's an obvious technique. They're making it obvious that they're using magic, which, fair enough if you're in the middle of a fight, so that too. Next, if they decide that they want to, say, use a special item. So this would typically be something like an ancient tome, heavy tablet, or delicate scroll that is required but is relatively easy to come by, like a short journey, some bartering, or minor expenditure. So let's say they buy a special item at the shop, and now they can cast fireballs. With all those requirements, they brought it down to 2 arcane power in cost. Which, pretty good at this point. So, yeah. Now, we get to spells of the second magnitude. These are incredibly powerful spells that you could run an entire adventure building up to the casting of. Like, the whole adventure could be gathering components and getting ready to use this magic spell before the sorcerer casts it at the climax. So, second magnitude spells are things like summoning more lesser demons as opposed to first magnitude, which can only summon minor demons. Things like, say, creating a storm with magic, or, for example, shattering a wall with magic. And I would like to note that the Everyone's book expands on sword and sorcery. Like they have an Everyone's sword and sorcery book that is compatible with Barbarians of Lemuria and can expand on all of this stuff, so I do recommend having it. Though I will tell you how I think of things, and there are some contradictions in how I prefer to do things with how everyone prefers it, or Barbarians of Lemuria might. And also, I would like to note that for first magnitude spells, and second too, it's perfectly fine if you want to add intelligence to the damage done, because first magnitude spells do 1d6 damage by itself, which maybe not quite enough for a sorcerer who's getting a lot of fights. So if you want to add intelligence to the damage their magic does, go ahead. Anyway, so second magnitude spells. If we're talking about a spell in warfare, using examples from Conan, it might be something like, say, creating a massive wall of fire in the middle of a battle to consume the enemy cavalry. Or if you're talking about a second magnitude spell that attacks a single target, I like to think of it of that time in a Conan book a sorcerer pulled someone still beating hard out of their body from 20 feet away. The Everyone book describes second magnitude spells as doing 2d6 damage, but personally, I prefer to think of it as a first magnitude spell is you might kill someone with it. Sort of like how if you shoot them with an arrow, you might kill them or they might live. But a first magnitude spells might kill them. So you might shoot them with an arrow or they might live. A second magnitude spell either guarantees death for a single person, or it potentially kills a group of them. And if you think that's too overpowered, then go ahead and use either the Everyone system or make it so that you can expend a hero point to make it so that a second magnitude spell doesn't kill you or give people some sort of roll to resist death. Now, second magnitude spells cost 10 arcane power at their base, and they can be reduced to a minimum of 6 arcane power by taking requirements. And so you could potentially pull one off out of nowhere, but if you do it, it's going to cost you quite a lot. And I will get to arcane power recovery, but the second magnitude spells requirements are generally similar to first magnitude spells. But they're more. For example, wounds. You might have some ritual scarification for first magnitude. For second magnitude, it might be inflicting some serious wounds. For ritual sacrifice, rather than a little bloodletting, it might be killing an animal. For rare ingredients, you need to take 1d6 weeks and at least a purse of gold to get the needed items. And finally, we get to third magnitude spells. These are the absolutely most powerful of all magic spells, and they bring incredible amounts of power to them. Oh, and one of the things I also like to note is that shapeshifting is typically described as a second magnitude spells, but some sorcerers can pretty easily shapeshift in Conan, so I don't think it would be too out of the issue to make at least shapeshifting into something smaller than you a first magnitude spell. So anyway, third magnitude spells. So this is stuff like creating an earthquake, turning someone into a permanent, turning a group of people, I think would probably be better, into permanent mental slaves. Things like creating vast visions, summoning greater demons. The most powerful expenditures of magic. And there is a permanent cost with third magnitude spells. So you must either reduce an attribute by 1 point permanently, or reduce arcane power by 1 permanently. So, this is regardless of how much you reduce the other costs. You are going to have to pay this price. And keep in mind that for third magnitude spells, the various requirements are pretty harrowing to reduce them. At least they can be, like human sacrifice, spelled permanently, maybe transforming the caster into a demon, getting an absolute shit ton of assistance to help you, massive injuries, etc. And now, recovering arcane power. So I'm going to simplify things a bit, but basically you recover 4 points of arcane power used to create first magnitude spells once a day. You gain that for cantrips twice a day. Second and third magnitude spells you recover once a month for arcane power in any case. So this means that even if you reduce your second magnitude spells down to 6, you're still going to be out of 2, and even if you do it right before the spell, cast it, right before you would recover your arcane power, you're still going to be out 2 arcane power for a month. Second and third magnitude spells are costly, but they can bring a lot of power. So then the game gives various examples of magic spells that you might want to cast, things like beguiling, dread ships, demonic blades, conjuring items, evil eyes, etc. And the setting ends with basically some examples of cults in Lemuria, presumably people serving various gods or cultist things. Oh, and those hyenas. Yeah, and that brings us to the end of the chapter. So, thank you all for watching. The next chapter, which is pretty damn long, and like the last chapter, is Sagas of Lemuria. So, I hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching, everyone, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe.